I'm Dom Nichols, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, we bring you the latest updates from the front line, including a dispatch from our foreign correspondent James Kilner on what's next for Yevgeny Prigozhin and can he stay alive. We discuss whether a state can remain neutral in the face of Russia's blatant disregard for international norms, and ask a former tank unit commanding officer how could Ukraine breach Russia's extensive obstacle belt.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
We need a military strategy for Ukraine to gain a decisive advantage on the battlefield, to win the war.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 29th of June, 1 year and 125 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our assistant comment editor, Francis Dearnley, foreign correspondent James Kilner, and former Royal Tank Regiment commander, Hamish DBG. I started with the latest updates from Ukraine. Firstly, the death toll of the Kramatorsk pizza restaurant strike has risen to 12. Rescue operations at the site of the attack have been completed, according to, this is from the regional governor of Donetsk, Pavlo Kyrylenko. He said, I'm asking everyone, do not neglect safety measures, evacuate to safer regions of Ukraine. Now, Britain's ambassador to Ukraine, Dame Melinda Simmons, she said in a tweet this morning, the Russian attack on Kramatorsk is heartbreaking. Ukrainian children amongst those killed in a missile attack on a pizza restaurant, so obviously not a military installation, but a popular venue for residents and visitors. The rap sheet against Russia continues to grow. Ukrainian officials said that the restaurant was hit by an Iskander short-range ballistic missile. It was originally thought it was an S-300 surface-to-air missile, but they're now saying an Iskander. And Ukraine's intelligence agency, the SBU, they said last night that they'd detained an individual who lived in Kramatorsk and worked in a local gas logistics firm, and said that this guy was an agent of Russia helping to identify targets. They said that the man had been taking a video of the restaurant and the surrounding area and had sent it to Russian forces prior to the attack. Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office says that man has been arrested. They haven't named him yet or said what if he's responded in any way, but they've said he's arrested on suspicion of committing treason. That's an offence that carries a possible life sentence in Ukraine. And President Volodymyr Zelensky last night in his video address, his nightly video address, he said anyone who helps Russian terrorists destroy lives deserves the maximum punishment. Now, Russian sources have said that the building that was targeted, the pizza restaurant, was hit because it was what they consider a regular banqueting site of Ukrainian troops and NATO mercenaries, they say. The Kremlin, in a statement, said it had hit a temporary Ukrainian army command post. But they didn't say why, if it was a sensitive place such as a command post. 14-year-old twin girls Yulia and Anna Aksenchenko and another 17-year-old child were there. So answer me that, trolls. What were those kids doing at an army command post, or do you just enjoy murdering civilians? Secondly, next one. One of Russia's warplanes that was reported to be shot down in the mad dash on Saturday by the Wagner Rebellion, whatever we're calling it, was a special mission aircraft with a key role in Russia's war, according to Britain's MOD. So today's Defence Intelligence update, the MOD said Wagner had reportedly shot down an Ilyushin IL-22M aircraft. That's part of a relatively small fleet. There's only 12 of those M versions, and we think only about 30 IL-22s in the fleet. But British MOD is saying this one, the 22M, is heavily utilised for both airborne command and control and radio relay tasks. So airborne command and control, basically, it's bring your own air traffic control in areas where you don't have an air traffic control and you need to coordinate your air assets and make sure they don't bang into each other and all that kind of stuff. You bring your own bubble of air traffic control, and that's what this thing was doing. Now, footage on social media, you'll find it, showed an aircraft which is thought to be the Ilyushin just falling from the sky in flames. This was on Saturday in the vicinity of Voronezh, and it was reported that all 10 occupants on board were killed. And we think at least 5, maybe 6 other military helicopters, including the sophisticated Ka-52 Alligator gunships, were also thought to be shot down, all part of Wagner's dash north. So on the update, the MOD said, as high-value assets, they have operated within the safety of Russian airspace. This is the Aleutians they're talking about now, far beyond the range of Ukrainian air defense systems. The loss of this aircraft is likely to have a negative impact on Russian air and land operations. In the short term, the psychological shock of losing a large number of aircrew in this manner will almost certainly damage morale within the Russian aerospace force. They then go on talking about the longer term and say there is a possibility that current tasking levels may have to be reduced to safely manage the remaining fleet. This will likely undermine Russia's ability to command and coordinate its forces, particularly during periods of high-tempo operations. I mean, it is very tricky coordinating all that stuff. So if they've only got 11 now, and you can imagine from that you'd expect in a Western military from 11 aircraft, you should probably expect 6 or 7 to be serviceable at any one time, and then probably of those maybe 3 or 4 to be ready to go today for tasking, crewed up, fueled, all the rest of it. So it does have an impact. I know, losing one if you've got 12 is not huge, but it does all count. Now, finally, Switzerland has blocked the gifting of 96 non-operational Leopard 1 tanks that are currently stored in Italy. They are the property of the Swiss arms manufacturer Raug. The proposal was that these vehicles are going to be refurbished in Germany and then sent to Ukraine. The Swiss government said the request is, quote, inconsistent with applicable law. And that's because Switzerland is a neutral country which can't approve arms sales bound for an active conflict zone, which does kind of beg the question, why make the weapons in the first place? Maybe it's just because it brings in a ton of cash while others defend the system's values and the international order you're happy to take profit from. But, who knows? But to show how ridiculous this stance is, I would just ask you to hold in your mind the decision some time ago, unconnected from today, but a separate decision some weeks ago that did get the full backing of the Swiss government, the decision to send 25 Leopard 2 tanks that are currently in service in the Swiss army. They're going to go to Germany next year. Now, Germany has promised not to send those tanks to Ukraine, but they will fill gaps in the German military because Germany is sending a load of other Leopard 2s to Ukraine. I mean, we are properly dancing on a head of a pin here. I would invite you to have a look at Stanley Pignall, who writes for The Economist. He's tweeted today reminding us of an article he wrote in January. I've retweeted it, so if you're not following Stanley or The Economist, have a look at my feed and you'll see the link there. He wrote an article in January which says Switzerland's policy of neutrality in the face of such disregard by Russia for human life and the acceptable conduct in the modern world is looking naive or worse. So Switzerland recently reviewed its neutrality doctrine and decided to stick with it, and says it will only supply hardware to Ukraine if the UN Security Council condemn Russia, which, that's not going to happen for as long as Russia is there and has veto power. We can talk about whether they should still be, but that is a longer conversation. They're not going to veto that at the moment. So all Switzerland's really done so far is to mirror the sanctions that have been imposed by the EU, and even that step has been criticised by some in the Swiss sort of government. So Stanley Pignall says, neutrality looks increasingly like a simplistic answer to complex geopolitical questions. The security of Europe is being fought over in Ukrainian trenches. Any country on the continent declaring itself neutral about the outcome is announcing that its own safety is of scant concern. Non-neutrals resent this. Their guns are implicitly defending neutrals, which get to splurge on more butter and boast of their virtue to boot. Now, in a related issue, today, Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer has said neutral EU countries object to giving Ukraine outright security assurances. Mr. Nehammer is in Brussels at a meeting of other EU government leaders. Speaking before that meeting, he said, "For us as neutral states, it is clear we can't give security guarantees. Austria, Ireland, Malta and Cyprus have made it clear they have objections. The role of the neutral status needs to be explicitly taken into account. We will certainly discuss this and we will find formulations that will be acceptable for us as well." It just throws the whole issue of neutrality into sharp focus. And it's one thing to be neutral, I think, when there's not a war in Europe and the egregious abuse of international norms that we're seeing. I think we're in a different place now. This conversation seems to be gathering pace there. Francis, I know you'll have some views on this. What do you say on that, and what else is crossing your desk today?
Well, thanks, Dom. Of course, the other country that neutrality debate is highly relevant to is Ireland. And I know we have many Irish listeners, so very keen to hear their perspectives on this too. The concept of Irish neutrality has a rich and intricate history, which I don't have time to go into in detail now. But whilst Irish military forces have actively participated in UN peacekeeping missions, Ireland itself has a commitment not to deploy its forces overseas without a specific resolution from the UN Security Council. And in practice, of course, that means that due to the power of veto held by countries like Russia, reaching a unanimous decision is almost impossible on the Council, and thereby Ireland, if it wanted to, is not really able to do much more to assist Ukraine. And there has been interesting movement, actually, amongst Irish leaders towards wanting to do more, I think. But as I say, their hands are tied by this sort of understanding of their neutrality. Now, on the comment desk, we're hoping to publish an article this week by the former UK Defence Secretary, Sir Michael Fallon, who suggests there is potential for Ireland to contribute further to enhancing Europe's security. There is, of course, the North Sea Security Pact that Belgium, the UK, Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands are all involved in. I think he thinks that they can do more to be involved in that. And he really underlines a crucial point here, which I haven't read elsewhere, and which is why we're keen to get it in print, is that the Irish Sea is very susceptible to Russia's negative influence. So approximately 75% of transatlantic cables pass through or near Ireland's exclusive economic area. Moreover, Ireland serves as a host to a third of Europe's data companies and houses the headquarters of numerous important tech firms. So you've got those vulnerabilities as well as its energy infrastructure, which is exposed to Russian threats. And so there is, I think, very much conversations taking place at the moment about how Ireland, if it wants to do more, can do more, and indeed should it be doing more given these vulnerabilities, which we have, as I say, touched on in the past, but not quite gone into that level of granular detail. But turning to updates, I spoke yesterday about the fallout from the weekend, and there are more as a consequence. So General Sergei Sirotkin, who, as we discussed, is reported to potentially have known about the failed Wagner mutiny, according to some US intelligence sources, has not been seen since Saturday, and speculation has emerged this morning that he's actually been arrested. So officials are trying to establish whether the man nicknamed General Armageddon, of course a man we've talked about a lot on the pod, had a close relationship with Prigozhin, and whether he actually, as a consequence of that, knew about the mutiny. So the Ministry of Defense in Russia has told the Moscow Times that he has actually been arrested, or at least officials there have, but we haven't been able to independently verify that. One source alleged that Sirotkin has chosen the side of Mr. Prigozhin in the mutiny, and there's fear that he was part of what they call a Prigozhin coalition. Again, all of this, must stress, is speculation, and I know that James will have more thoughts on this, but it's quite interesting looking at the remarks that Sirotkin put out over the weekend when the incident was occurring. So he was appealing to Wagner publicly, saying, "We fought together with you, took risks, we won together, we are of the same blood, we are warriors. I urge you to stop. The enemy is just waiting for the internal political situation to escalate in our country." So publicly he was coming out to condemn Wagner, but perhaps this was a ruse, and that really he was quietly supporting them. We just don't know. We have no way of knowing yet. But suffice to say, it's extremely helpful for the Ukrainians to have the Russian state having to question the loyalty of these senior military figures. Many are asking, how can an army function effectively in these circumstances? And I'll come back to that in my final thoughts. Now, we've also just heard in the last 30 minutes or so that Sirotkin's deputy, Colonel General Andrei Yudin, has reportedly been fired from the army. And if that's true, then it would seem to verify this argument that Sirotkin is now very much out of favour and may have been arrested himself. Now, returning to Prigozhin specifically, and his exile in Belarus. The exiled Belarusian opposition leader, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, has said that Lukashenko could betray Prigozhin despite his offer of refuge following the mutiny over the weekend. So she's given an interview with AFP in Brussels and has said that they are not allies. They cannot trust each other. At any moment, Lukashenko can betray Prigozhin. Prigozhin can betray Lukashenko. And of course, we hypothesized on that very question yesterday. But for her, she goes further and says that this is really about personal survival for Lukashenko. She says he didn't act just to save Putin's face or save Prigozhin or not to let the civil war happen in Russia. He took care for his personal survival because Lukashenko knows that if the powers in Russia are scrambling, it will be Lukashenko who will be next. And again, that does tally with our analysis on Wednesday, but strong remarks from her. An unstable Putin is certainly bad news for Lukashenko, given the vital support that he receives from Russia, though there is reason to think that he may well rue the invitation of Prigozhin into the country, depending on what happens next. But as I say, I know James will have more reflections on this.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. We'll turn to James shortly. I should just say that we're going to put up our weekly Defence in Depth video today, later on today, about 6 o'clock London time. I didn't do it this week. I was away Monday, Tuesday. So hand over, I said last week, to a special guest. So I can reveal that that's Alyona Halivko, friend to the pod. She's going to be taking us through the new characters that we are starting to hear. I mean, we've met Svetlana Tikhanovskaya before, the exiled Belarusian, the legitimate winner of the 2020 election. But some of these other names, Sirotkin and some of the other people close to Putin, we've not really met before. Alyona is going to take us through these characters, bring them to life, because I think we're going to hear more about them. So we need to familiarise ourselves with them. But James, fascinating ideas now, and you've written a piece. What now for Prigozhin, and how can he stay alive? James, what do you think?
That piece I wrote it on Monday and Tuesday, and by its very nature, was very speculative because at the time I wrote it, Prigozhin's whereabouts was still unknown. He's now obviously confirmed to have flown into Minsk to start his time in exile. I mean, I haven't seen any strong reporting out of Minsk about what, the sort of life he's leading. But it's important to remember two things. What happens to Wagner Group now and the rest of Prigozhin's media empire, internet troll empire, if you want, and also what we can expect of him in exile. Like, is he going to be under house arrest? Is he going to be free to roam around, etc.? And in that story I wrote a couple of days ago, I was really trying to remind readers that there is already a relatively high-profile former Soviet president in exile, living in exile in Minsk, and that's Kurmanbek Bakiev. He's a former Kyrgyz president between 2005 and 2010, when he was unseated in a revolution, and Minsk was negotiated as his way out. Prigozhin was given that option over the weekend as well. Now, Bakiev, who has been imprisoned in absentia in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan for various crimes and massive corruption, etc., has been able to lead a relatively free life, it appears, in Belarus. We've seen photos of him meeting Lukashenko several times, inspecting plans to expand the city. Lukashenko, on his 70th birthday, on Bakiev's 70th birthday in 2019, even gave him a big painting of nomads and a knife, this sort of thing. And this was all broadcast live, not live, it was broadcast on the Belarusian TV. So we know that Lukashenko enjoys the limelight. He's already used Bakiev, his exile guest, previously, and I would expect him to do the same with Prigozhin, who's obviously a much more high-profile character. Indeed, he's even said, he gave a sort of rather rambling and long briefing to his officials, I think it was on Tuesday, about this role that he says he played in talking Prigozhin down from attacking the Kremlin on Saturday. And in that rambling explanation, he did say he was looking forward to learning about Wagner's experience in Ukraine. So I think this is all hinting at maybe Prigozhin is going to have some relative freedom. I mean, it's too early to be sure, obviously. And maybe we will see photos of him and Lukashenko talking or even shaking hands, that sort of thing. Now, the impact that is going to have in the Kremlin and on Putin is going to be really interesting to see. Like Francis and Dom have already said, Lukashenko is on thin ice here. Prigozhin, in my analysis, slightly, I mean, he obviously went against Putin, his master, but it was a rebellion, in my analysis, that got out of hand, went too far. It was never meant to end up 120 miles from Moscow. But he has become Putin's, he betrayed Putin. Putin does not stand for traitors. So if Lukashenko is seen giving Prigozhin too warm a welcome, that will have implications. So there's that. And the other thing to really consider is what happens to Wagner next. Now, really quickly, as our listeners know, Wagner operates many different services for the Kremlin. One of the big ones is the sort of autocratic consultancy service that it offers primarily in Africa to various countries, where the various leaders of these African countries employ various parts of Wagner or Concord Group and another one of Prigozhin's outfits in different roles. It could be how to fix an election without doing it too blatantly. It could be simply supplying bodyguards, or it could be hiring ruthless mercenary fighting units to take on your enemies. So there's a whole suite of different things. So in return, Wagner get various mining rights and they get paid hard cash as well. But this is a very lucrative business for the Kremlin. Not only does it bring in a lot of cash, but it also gives them a lot of influence. And the reports I'm reading is that the Kremlin will want to continue this type of operation in Africa, but they may need to rebrand it. They may need to take day-to-day control or week-to-week control, whatever it is, away from Prigozhin, cut him out of the system. So again, all that is happening. I did read a report this morning that Wagner and Prigozhin's media group, Patriot Media Group, is already looking for a new owner. So his empire is already being dismantled. Part of that media group was a troll company, which famously tried to manipulate the 2016 US presidential election. So an important and high-profile Kremlin operation, which Prigozhin had been heading, is already being taken away from him. So I think we're already starting to see his role being marginalised.
Thanks, James. Now, just briefly, before I go back to Francis for some more diplomatic updates, and then Hamish, I saw yesterday Putin's been in Dagestan. Now, stand fast the debate about, was it a body double, et cetera, because this guy was out with the crowds, mixing it, shaking hands, which is not usual Putin behaviour. But did you see this? And why go to Dagestan? What does this mean? You rarely get the guy out of Moscow, and yet he goes off to one of the republics. What do you think is going on there?
I did see it briefly, Dom. He was in Dagestan on the Caspian Sea coast, a town I visited in 2007, UNESCO heritage site. I think he just needed to be seen to be meeting the people, to have a walk around, to be closer to the action. And I think this was his way of doing that. The videos I've seen, it looked like, a complete setup, etc., and jubilant crowds. But I think it was really important for him to get out and about and shown to be traveling. He, across Russia, not just to, walk around Red Square or something. He had to get out to one of the regions. And I can't remember him making a visit to the North Caucasus, I could be wrong, since the start of the war. And Dagestan on the Caspian Sea coast, about 100 miles or 120 miles north of the border of Azerbaijan, is really on the fringe of his domain. And I think this was just a necessary PR stunt from a president who's looking incredibly weak at the moment, humiliated. He's becoming increasingly differing source of mockery, really, in many ways in the Kremlin. And he needed to show the cameras that some people still, appreciated his time and visit.
I saw one suggestion saying that the proportion of fighters who are just being pulled in, given 2 weeks training, very loosely termed training, and shoved out to die in Ukraine are coming from the regions, not from the rich, not from the cities, not Moscow, St. Petersburg, and that he needed to go and shore up a bit of support there. I mean, do you think it was shoring up support or possibly a bit of a recruitment drive? We know he doesn't want to announce a second mobilization, but do you think he has to go and show a bit of love to the regions, because that's where the greater proportion of people who are fighting and dying in the name of his ridiculous warped dream are coming from.
Yeah, you could definitely take that line. I mean, I do remember in September, October last year, when a week or so after mobilisation was called, there were quite large, probably some of the most serious protests in Russia were in Dagestan, in the capital of Dagestan's Makhachkala, where mothers of the men being mobilised were really trying to stand up to the authorities, the policemen. So, yeah, I think maybe he's trying to show, like I said, the recruitment drive, or maybe he's just trying to show I can still go where I fancy in my domain, and I'm going to go to the very fringe of it, where we've been recruiting a lot of people and where there has been resistance.
Lovely, thanks, James. Let's just quickly go back to Francis. A bit more news, Francis, from about NATO, and you're going to get your arms around the EU, I hear.
Well, I wouldn't go quite that far, Dom, but yes, in other news, as we speculated last week, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary-General, is to become one of the military alliance's longest-serving leaders, as his term is on the verge of being extended by another year. That's according to the Times of London. Diplomatic sources have told them that an announcement will be made as soon as next week, that the former Norwegian Prime Minister will remain in post until summer next year, meaning he will have held the position for a decade. And we've, of course, spoken on the podcast at length last week about the internal discussions around who should succeed him, tensions around certain political leaders. Of course, Ben Wallace, Defence Secretary here in the UK, was, we understand, put forward, but the French said they didn't want him. They felt it should be a European leader. An interesting dispute given the political context of Brexit and everything else. But clearly they've decided they can't agree, and so they want to extend Mr. Stoltenberg's duration. I think many people think he has been very effective since the full-scale invasion, and so as a consequence, it perhaps doesn't come as a surprise that he comes across as a good compromise candidate. Now, this coincides with another interesting story from the EU, again discussed in the Times, that the EU hopes to fill the void left in Africa by the decline of the Wagner Group, which James was just talking about. As I mentioned in Saturday's bonus episode, the implosion of Wagner offers a huge opportunity, really, for the West to erode the power of one of Russia's most dangerous international outfits for its international purposes. So in the piece, the European Union's ambassador to the African Union is quoted as saying that the uncertainty over Wagner's future creates an opening for European states to re-engage with countries like Mali. She's quoted as saying it's only been a few days and analysis is still being carried out, but immediately we are looking at what a weakening of Wagner would mean. It will definitely put pressure on it in the countries where it is operating. What can they offer now? And the piece also quotes an EU security official as saying that the states see this as an opportunity to win back influence. Without Wagner, there is no delivery, and without delivery, why cooperate with them? But nonetheless, the Times does highlight how other analysts believe Wagner's role in Africa is too important for Russia to let go. They quote the Royal United Services Institute, a very prominent think tank here, that Wagner will be rebranded and operations are likely to continue because of Russia's priorities, not only to support the war, but the indirect expenses Russia has incurred as a result of the war. They will want to remain there. This is a living ecosystem that will continue to grow, but will probably do so under another name. And I should add that others worry if Wagner ends its activities in Ukraine, that may lead to an influx of tens of thousands of Wagner fighters to the continent, where they could, of course, further destabilise other fragile regions. So we can't know for certain what the impact of this is, but I would argue that the story itself is the fact that we are now asking serious questions about Wagner in those places and how the West can potentially monopolise on their weakness and the fragility perhaps within the political apparatus within Russia. But staying on Europe, Poland expects the EU to help it fund measures to strengthen its eastern border as a consequence of Wagner moving into Belarus. So Poland has said they believe there are around 8,000 Wagner troops already in Belarus and are taking both temporary and permanent steps to strengthen its border, including boosting the presence of security forces and increasing fortifications. So asked today whether Brussels would help Warsaw pay for such measures, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Poland said Poland expects it. European solidarity means supporting countries threatened with destabilisation. These safeguards need to be increased. An indicator, if one was necessary, of quite how seriously some countries in Europe are taking developments in Belarus. But finally, I promised yesterday a few more reflections on developments in the US that were overshadowed by the mutiny. The first is that the US Senate has introduced a resolution which proposes that the actions of Russia, Belarus, or a proxy of Russia be considered as an attack on NATO if those actions lead to radioactive contamination of an ally's territory. So this is the resolution that was introduced by the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and Democrat Richard Blumenthal. So it's explicitly designed to be bipartisan. So these senators noted that this is the first precedent since the collapse of the USSR that Russia has moved its nuclear weapons beyond its own borders. And they say it's a serious threat to global security amid the war in Ukraine. But they also emphasise the unpredictable situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is, of course, under the control of Russian occupying forces. And I'll quote from Mr. Graham directly. He says, "The threat of a use of a nuclear device by Russia is real. And the best way we believe to deter it is to give them clarity, the Russians, as to what will happen if they do that. And our message is to those around Putin: if you do this, if you follow his orders, if he ever gives them, you can expect a massive response from NATO. You will be at war with NATO." And indeed, his Democratic counterpart echoes this and then says that if Putin's military risks total obliteration, they will be reckless and irrational to resort to any nuclear warfare of any kind. And they suggest that the Biden administration conduct consultations with leaders of other countries in Europe and consider actions to minimise the threat to civilian population and prepare a diplomatic and military response that tallies with the severity of the situation, particularly on Zaporizhzhia. To stress, this is highly unlikely to become law, but it is designed to send a clear signal about what tactical nukes would mean and any use of a staged nuclear incident at Zaporizhzhia. For reasons that regular listeners will know, I personally welcome this. I still think many, too many, see it as inconceivable that Russia would stage some kind of incident at Zaporizhzhia, but sources that I trust say otherwise. So it's surely right for Western powers to make clear its red lines regarding these kind of incidents, and in doing so potentially deter them. But the other story from the US relates to the remarks of President Obama in the interview with CNN that he gave a few days ago. He was defending his administration's reaction to the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and argued that the full-scale invasion launched by Putin last year came in a very different context. So when he was reflecting on 2014, he says, and I quote, "Both myself but also Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, who I give enormous credit for, had to pull in a lot of other Europeans kicking and screaming to impose the sanctions that we did and to prevent Putin from continuing through the Donbass and to the rest of Ukraine. Given both where Ukraine was at the time and where the European mindset was at the time, we held the line." And he goes further. He says it was a different Ukraine then, which is something strongly contested by many Ukrainians, both in the Ukrainian government and who are commentating on this, who argue that there is actually no fundamental difference in 2014 between what's happened then and has happened in 2022, only a difference in perception and an understanding of Ukraine that has increased in the years since. Critics of Obama point to his earlier remarks too regarding the threat posed by Russia. Politico have done a piece pulling out some of those quotes. When he was campaigning for re-election in 2012, he dismissed his Republican opponent Mitt Romney for being out of touch with the realities of American foreign policy after Romney called Russia the US's number one geopolitical foe. And I'll quote from Obama. He said to Mitt Romney, "When you were asked what's the biggest threat facing America, you said Russia, not Al-Qaeda, you said Russia. The 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because the Cold War's been over for 20 years. And many people are now saying that in retrospect, perhaps Romney was right as to the threat that Russia posed relative to Al-Qaeda. I personally will need to reread Obama's memoir on this, which was obviously written long before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine last year. All that I will say is that given the events of the past year and a half and its enormous ramifications for geopolitics, perhaps the most significant foreign policy event since 9/11, the invasion of Crimea in 2014 does not feature prominently in that book. Syria looms much larger. And he admits, as I've talked about in the past, that the vote in the House of Commons here in Britain deterred him from following through with his administration's red lines on chemical warfare. So I think that's interesting, and it will be very interesting indeed to see whether in Volume 2, which I think he's writing at the moment, the events in Ukraine trigger a reassessment and more analysis of exactly what occurred. But I think it is very revealing that one doesn't leave that book and think, wow, Ukraine was one of the major events. It just doesn't come across that way. He does, though, put forward some very interesting descriptions of what it was like one-on-one with Putin. And I remember there's one bit where he talks about how Putin would sit him down and just sort of rant at him for an hour, which again is quite revealing about what Putin saw as the failures of American foreign policy with regard to Russia. But I imagine Hamish will also have some very interesting thoughts on the impact of this resolution with regard to Zaporizhia.
Thanks, Francis. Certainly will be. Let's turn now to Hamish DBG. Hamish to Breton Gordon. Hamish, very welcome back on the pod. We've been talking today. We've had Wagner, we've had Lukashenko, we've had a bit of Zaporizhia, nukes in general. Now, linking all of that is the one guy we started off talking about, Sirotkin. You had close quarters interaction with him in Syria. So why don't we start there, and I'd be interested in all your thoughts on the issues we've been discussing, and then maybe finish off with a question that's come from a number of listeners, and thanks so much for getting in touch with us, talking about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. How on earth can you get through an obstacle belt of minefields, tank ditches and all the rest of it? But let's start with Sirotkin.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Sirotkin is a really interesting character. As I said, I saw him in Syria. His unconventional violence that he developed there, we are seeing at the moment in Ukraine. Sirotkin is a really evil person, but he's a very effective commander. I find it astounding that, at this time when the Russian army are performing so badly, Sirotkin and Prigozhin, who've both been very effective in the field, and their close associates in this Kremlin purge have been dismissed. And when you think that Shoigu, the defense minister, and Gerasimov, the commander of the military, are in effect desk Johnnies, what I mean by that is, they've got loads of medals, but not many of them for actually fighting. This, I think, will have a really serious impact on the Russian military. So if I go hopefully seamlessly into the next piece, and what Francis is saying about the Senate move to not hopefully bring into law, but perhaps not, that any use of tactical nuclear weapons or blowing up a Zaporizhia would be an Article 5, in other words, bringing NATO in. I think that is the most powerful thing that's happened in the international community to reduce this. But I'd just like to take those two separately. First of all, there is speculation, there is rumour. And I believe my assessment is that there probably aren't any tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. The Russians are using the tactical nukes to try and put pressure on Europe, try and frighten European leaders, particularly the Germans, into not supporting. And that just hasn't worked. The idea of giving Lukashenko and now potentially Prigozhin, because I think the other thing that I missed half of the pod yesterday, I was at the Chalk Valley History Festival, but Lukashenko has suggested he quite would like the Wagner troops as his sort of private army, and maybe Prigozhin, getting involved in there as well. I cannot believe that Putin would allow Lukashenko and now potentially Prigozhin, to have a finger on a red button to use tactical nukes. Because if things implode even more than they are at the moment, Lukashenko might well, point those nukes in the other direction. The piece on Zaporizhia, which I advise a lot of people in Europe and elsewhere who are deeply concerned about any sort of environmental accident or particularly nuclear accident. Speaking to a lot of people in Kyiv yesterday, and of course, I think it was over the weekend that the Ukraine intelligence service gave their report on what they assessed to be Russian activity in Zaporizhia, and wiring it with explosives and mines. Now, they were absolutely right about the dam. And I think on the pod, we called it at the time as well, that it was a Russian-produced explosion. So they were right on the dam. everybody else who's briefing me and I speak to seem to agree with them. So the move by the Americans to really point this out, that it would be, tantamount to getting NATO fully engaged in the war, is absolutely the right thing that they can do. The only thing I would say, of course, it's also highly deniable. The Russians have been building up that the Ukrainians are going to blow it up, and their weight of propaganda and disinformation is absolutely torrential. So again, that is where it's a concern. And I suppose just about leading into your next question, Dom, the tactical significance of an accident, in inverted commas, at Zaporizhzhia on the offensive would have a similar impact to that of blowing up the dam. In other words, constricting and channeling and forcing the Ukraine forces into a certain area, which is why in the piece I wrote for the paper yesterday, I'm sort of suggesting that now is the time to let the shackles off the Ukrainian offensive and let them attack at a time and place and a direction of their choosing, which may or may not include an incursion into Russia.
I mean, that's interesting, the idea about the incursion into Russia. Just before you talk about what that movement on the ground might look like and getting through obstacle belts, do you want to just address one of the questions that one of the listeners just put in the comment section? And thank you for doing so, Dennis. He questions your description of Sirotkin and Prigozhin as effective. Do you want to just take us back over that and give a little bit more detail as to why you say that?
Absolutely. I mean, effective might be the wrong word, but when you have no morals or scruples, and you have no concern for collateral damage or civilian casualties, you can pretty much do what you like. And in Syria, Sirotkin, when he took over, he instigated this attack of attacking hospitals, attacking schools, attacking infrastructure, and burning civilians out of their homes, which actually sort of worked in Syria for the most part. When you then look at Ukraine, the fact Sirotkin is just in the trenches throwing more and more manpower, he's been effective in preventing, thus far, the counteroffensive. Now, he and Prigozhin have been at the front line doing their stuff. Now, Putin and Shoigu and Gerasimov, very similar to some other sort of autocratic tyrants like Hitler and others, commanding from far back. So when I say effective, I mean they're at the front line. They are ordering troops around, and they have no concern over casualties. So they can hold the line just by plugging it almost with human flesh, the meat grinder, as we said. So effective might be the wrong word, but had they fought with some sort of constraint, which the constraint the constraint that the Ukraine forces are on at the moment, I'm sure they would have capitulated a long time ago.
Hamish, could you turn your attention, please, to what is an obstacle belt? We talk about this Russian defensive line. We think in the south, around the Zaporizhzhia area, we think Ukraine have kind of hit the first line of defence and maybe in some areas got through that. But the big line, the second line of defence is about 20 Ks, we think-ish. South numbers very sketchy as to quite who's where. But we think the second line, the main line of defence, is still there and still intact. Whether or not Russia have the personnel to man it, and that obviously is critical, we don't know. But Hamish, can you just talk us through briefly what a defensive line looks like and how you get an armoured force through it?
Yeah, Dom, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the most challenging operations of war. There are so many factors that come into it to make it successful. Those of us who went through the breach in the first Gulf War back in the early 90s, we had air superiority, we had artillery superiority, we did it all at night, and had many, many, many routes. So I think one of the challenges is you've already described this defence. You've got these dragon's teeth, massive concrete blocks. You then got trenches and minefields. Mines are really along with drones, mines are what are defining, or anti-tank mines are almost defining this conflict. And almost every picture that you see on social media at the moment is a tank or an armoured vehicle being blown up by mines. So in order to be successful, there are a number of things. air superiority to start with. Well, the Ukrainians don't have that at the moment. You can counter that a little bit by the night. And we've talked about the night being really where Ukraine has an advantage with the superior night sights and also training. There were so many red-trousered retired colonels at the Chalk Valley History Festival last night discussing tanks and all the rest of it and telling me that, it is the end of armour. But actually, these people have not operated in this type of environment, certainly not recently. So that the night is the friend. So that, in a way, might counter some of the air. But you need to breach the minefields. In order to do that, you need some sort of cover, massive artillery and other screens. But breaching it, I'm sure you've seen the pictures of the Brits. We have something called a giant Viper, which is a massive, long, explosive cable, if you like, goes out to about 200 meters, blows the mines out of the way. But it then requires for a tank with a dozer blade, a mine plow on the front, to go and push the remaining mines out of the way, and then the remaining force can go through it. But you need a lot of these lines because a tank could strike a mine as it goes through and then block that, and then you can't develop that sort of that momentum which you need. So it is hugely challenging. And the Ukrainians, I think, hitherto, and I won't go over all ground, have been trying to find the place to do it. And once they find it, what I would say, and what I did say to people last night, is that the Russians they're just throwing manpower and they're throwing tanks into the front with little training. We are pretty certain that the Ukrainian military have been doing a lot of combined arms training over the last 3 months because they've had all the Western kit for about that time. And that, I'm sure, is all about the coordination, as I've said, between artillery, infantry and tanks, and also practicing to breach these defences. So that is the most challenging thing. And once they get through them, as you say, not all of them be manned, and I'm sure they're finding where they're light, they can then crack on at great speed. If they were able to manoeuvre around them, then things might accelerate. Now, perhaps it's a discussion for another pod, but when one looks at the ease of manoeuvre of admittedly the Wagner group all around Russia, particularly in the south, one just wonders, what is there to prevent them doing that, apart from the political expedient that NATO and particularly the US and the UK have not wanted any Western kit used on Russian soil, although you could argue that that's already happened. And now that Ukraine has retaken back areas of the Donbass that Russia annexed in 2014, that has already happened. But it is hugely challenging, and it will take time, and that's why. But I think all the turmoil that's happening at the moment, getting rid of your best field commanders, hopefully that'll only benefit the Ukrainians.
Lovely. Thanks, Hamish. We're going to start moving towards final thoughts now. But I just, as you were speaking there, just reminded me. So last night I was at I was invited to the US Ambassador's pad, Winfield House here in Regent's Park in London. I'd like to say it was just me and the ambassador, but no, there was about 200 or 300 other people there. I mean, it's no Chalk Valley, Chalk whatever literary festival, but hey, we got there. It was great. The Peach Melba whiskey cocktails took a bit of getting used to, but I put the effort in and got there in the end. I was speaking to some very senior military and civilian personnel, UK and US, and they were the big point that they were all making, basically independently of each other, was how we in the West have forgotten the need for mass. We just assume that it's going to be there. Not only that we'll have the stuff on the start line, and that takes into account, well, it completely ignores the fact of being interdicted or hit by the enemy in your logistic bases and your supply lines and all the rest of it. We just assume that we'll have all our tanks at the start line on day one of a war, but then that actually the enemy are going to make some pretty basic mistakes, and we are not going to suffer, or the ratios of our own forces being worn down are woefully out of date. This war has shown that Yes, there's a lot of technology and drones and exciting cyber-y satellite stuff, but actually, heavy metal, it really does still matter in this day and age. That was my big takeaway. Well, that and a hangover anyway. But anyway, final thoughts. Let's roll around final thoughts. Francis, can we come to you first, please?
Thanks, Dom. Just a quick one from me today. You'll be pleased to hear. I've heard some people saying that the mutiny ended up being a damp squib, that it's actually changed very little. I want to disagree with that. Just look already, as we've talked about today, what it's done to Russia's state apparatus, including how it's dealing with the army. It's had a huge destabilising impact there. I question strongly how effective an army can operate under these conditions. And indeed, retired Army Major General Mick Ryan has written on Twitter today that in his view, the ripples from the mutiny in Russia over the weekend will continue to propagate across Russian systems. And he talks about how it remains too early to make a full assessment of how the mutiny will impact battlefield operations. But he does believe there will be severe repercussions. He talks about how within the Russian military, there's a deep discomfort among its leaders and about the loyalty of different units, the unease amongst senior leaders about who they can trust in their chain of command, almost certainly going to have damaging impacts in the long run. And as we've already talked about on the podcast and speculated, it means that he may well be forced, Putin, so as to not be seen giving in to the mutiny, to keep in ineffective leaders like Shoigu, who was the target of Prigozhin's ire. That also may boost the Ukrainians in the weeks and months ahead. And I agree with Mick Ryan's analysis, and that's before we even talk about the reputational damage of Putin's standing in the eyes of the world. As I've said before, it may be weeks, months, years, maybe even decades before we can measure the full impact of the events of that weekend. Sometimes the impacts can be very hard to read, as was the case with the Kornilov affair in 1917, which I spoke about at the weekend. At the time, that was deemed a triumph for Kerensky's provisional government, deterring that coup. Only a couple of months later did it become clear that it had fatally undermined the government and unleashed forces, the Bolsheviks, that would eventually bring him down. So I'm convinced that regardless how it may seem at this moment, that will be one of the key moments of the war so far. We just don't yet know exactly how it will be so. But I don't believe history books will be written that ignore the fundamental changes that will have occurred internally as a consequence of that event.
Thanks, Francis. James, please.
I've been reporting on this since Friday evening. I watched it unfold in real time. It's a theory that I've been knocking around on the fringes, and I think it's important to talk about now because of recent events. It's my sort of contention and my speculation that the FSB and the Russian Ministry of Defense knew that this mutiny was going to happen. That's kind of half been confirmed already in the media reports, and that they decided to use it to their advantage. So listeners have to remember that they really hated Prigozhin. They really hated him. He's causing a huge problem for them, and they needed to destroy him. The way they were going to destroy him was destroying his relationship with Putin. That was Prigozhin's main trump card. Now, we know that Prigozhin said that he organized this mutiny to prove to the Ministry of Defense that he was, that Wagner Group should be maintained, etc., and to avoid being subverted to them. I think that the FSB and the Russian Ministry of Defense decided to open the way for Prigozhin, to let him get, so that his rebellion was too successful, and that he was then able to get within 120 miles of Moscow, scaring Putin, who denounced him publicly on TV, and then their trap was shut. They had destroyed that relationship. And if you look at the video of Sirotkin, now we've got to remember Sirotkin was an ally of Prigozhin, and he had been demoted already by the Ministry of Defense in January. If you look at his video that he put out, I think it was like very quickly after Prigozhin announced his rebellion. It was about 2 hours afterwards. And there are certain indications which suggest he'd already been arrested, and he was making this video under pressure. His body language was very hunched over, very unusual for him. His voice was also uneven. So that was one. But two bigger indicators for me was he wasn't wearing any epaulets on his shoulders, showing his rank. And that, for me, is the first time we've seen a Russian general without those ranks on his shoulders. So maybe he'd already been stripped of his ranks. There's that. And also he was unshaven. Now, I'd never seen a Russian general unshaven, and I'd never seen Sirotkin unshaven before. And I think you have to look at these little indicators, which to me suggest he'd already been arrested several hours earlier, and he was making this video under duress. It's inconceivable to me. It was inconceivable at the time to me that the FSB, which is much maligned, etc., but it's still very effective at human intelligence, didn't know about a mutiny which is coming from a group of mercenaries who'd been knocking around, several thousand of them knocking around in their camps in Donbass for several weeks. That makes no sense to me. I think they would have known about it. I think they allowed it to happen because they knew that this was their chance to destroy Prigozhin and ruin his relationship with Putin. To do that, they also had to arrest Sirotkin beforehand and make sure he got this video out. I think that's what we've been watching happening.
That's absolutely fascinating stuff. Thanks, James. Hamish, would you like the final thought, please?
Just picking up on your point about heavy metal, it was the Land Warfare Conference, the British Army sort of conference this week, and contemporary of mine, General Patrick Saunders, he obviously did rather better than me, was really saying what you were saying, Dom. I'm a little bit perturbed today to hear Debs Haynes from Sky News suggesting that he actually might be losing post early. So I hope that is not talking truth to power, because we need people like Patrick around to make it happen. But my final thing is I was plugging this amazing pod all night last night. So I will plug the Chalk Valley History Festival, goes on until Sunday. Really, most of the best, or a lot of the best historians in the country are there. Lots of very interesting people. If you're in the southwest, pop along.
Thank you, Dom, Francis, James and Hamish. This is regular host David Knowles. Last week in Kyiv, I caught up with Angelica Kababi. Angelica works for the UHearts Foundation. We've interviewed their CEO, Yuri Tarkovsky, several times on this podcast. Angelica was kind enough to show me parts of Kyiv that I hadn't actually seen before. While walking around the city, I took the opportunity to ask her a few questions about her life in the last few months. Here's our conversation. Angelica, we're in a really spectacular part of Kyiv. Can you just describe what we're looking at, what we're next to?
Yeah, of course. We are now in the Sampark area. It's called Volodymyrska Girka or Volodymyrska Hills. I don't know, because it's really a place with some hills. And then we have some monuments of person. It's Volodymyr Veliki, Volodymyr Bika, I think it can be just...
Volodymyr the Great, yeah.
Yeah, the Great, yeah, thank you so much. And it's a person who brings to Kyiv Rus the Christianity religion. And it's like a small legend that it was like right here where we are standing now. Then people take this religion in the near the river Dnipro. So yeah, it's a good place now for walking, for relaxing, walk with families, have a picnic. Now it's really beautiful because you can see the Dnipro River, huge, and green trees, and something like that.
And opposite us, over the Dnipro, is a sort of collection of islands covered in forest. You were telling me a little bit about them. This is sort of the party scene for young people. I can't believe how old that makes me sound saying that. The party scene for you. Tell us about the party scene.
Yeah, of course. It's really small islands near the Dnipro with beach, it's a couple beaches here. And young people love this area in the summer because it's really cool parties here can be, and they are spending their times mostly in the summer because it's really when the weather is like that, like today, it's really good to be in these beaches because it's like not so sunny and you can just walk near the water. Before the war, it was really more popular because you can spend all night here, and now you can't do it. But it still is going on for the 23 p.m. and that's all, and you must go home.
I was hearing some other people talk about this, how Kyiv used to be a sort of 24-hour city with parties all the time, like, everything's open, and now that's obviously not the case because of the curfew. What's that been like to live through?
I think many people agree with it because they don't have any, versions and other versions for this. But I think everybody is missed for this, and they trying to spend as much time as they have at the day and the evening to rest for fresh air, especially in the summer near the river or some green areas. Yeah, but everybody is missing for about this time and just waiting where they can spend all night. And because for young people it's, I think, important, not for only young, I think for everybody who loves it.
Could you tell us a little bit about how your life has changed over the past few months? I mean, international audiences will know just how badly bombarded Kyiv was during May. Can you tell us what that was like living here, and then how the last month in June has been different?
Yeah, it was stressful because you work all day and then you want to rest at night, and every night it's was really loud because of missiles attack, because of rocket attack, and it was without rest for it. You every night you just wake up because it's really loud, and you must find a safe place in your flat, or for somebody it's with some shelters, some bunkers. So yeah, it was horrible. Nobody is from my families or from my friends saying that, oh my God, I'm so where it stopped. Of course, everybody is worried about it, but everybody thinks just only about positive things, that some days it stops, and we just must to help our army to stop it. That's all. Everybody hates more our Russian. It's our
opponents.
Yeah. So everybody just hate them more, and that's all.
For international listeners, again, there have been quite a few scandals with the provision of bunkers and places of, protection for local people. What is it like living here? Do you have a bunker close to you? What do you do? Do your friends? How does that work?
Yeah, I have the metro station nearby, but it's 10 minutes walk from my house, and it's only in some special time that I can go to this, it's if we call it bunker, because metro it's always a more safely bunker as we can have in the city. And but we just check the news, and if I understand that it's some dangerous nearby me and nearby area where I'm now, I just find some place with 2 walls or something like that. Mostly I was in my bus and it's
in your bathroom?
In my bathroom. Yeah, I was in my bathroom because it's more safely than on the street to walk to the metro station, and most of my family or friends do the same. Only if it's metro nearby you, or you can have a really good safe place with it's not old underground place of your building or something like that, because we have really some problems with it. So maybe more safely it's in your house, not somewhere.
Final question from me. You mentioned earlier when we were talking as we were walking through this beautiful park that since the beginning of the full-scale invasion you'd really tried to stop speaking Russian. Could you tell us why? And also, is this common amongst your friends? Are you the only one?
Yeah, I think I'm not talking before in this language. All my family is talking in Ukrainian all of my life. But I know this language. I can, before this situation, I can use sometimes it. I can, watch the films with this language, or listening to the Russian music or something like that. But after the full-scale invasion, I stopped doing it because it's strange for me. It's language of aggressor, of persons who are killing here my people, my countries, and I just choose forget it. I think that it's a problem a little bit, but I'm trying to forget it. But yeah, actually, many of my friends is change it because they understand that. I think a few years and it's disappeared from our country, and you must understand it right now and do something to I don't know, to make this process more quickly and I don't know, live without anything that can describe words Rus. So yeah.
But just on that, is there any, for those of your country, people who still speak Russian, who speak Russian to each other, is there any bad feeling between them or not?
No, I think it's okay because it's like they decide to do it, and I just understand it and hope that someday they can understand also all the situation and why it's important to use your language, like your language of your country. But it's without problems. People just can speak, I don't know, any language that they understand, use, and that's all. Like inside of me, I just hope that some people also can understand that it's not cool to do it, to speak these languages. But inside the country, for people, it's not a problem. Nobody just, when you heard that some person talking in Russian, so nobody is say, oh my God, what are you doing? Nobody is doing here this.
Is there anything we haven't spoken about that you'd want to say, that you think our listeners should know?
I think it's good to see you here. First of all, because it's important to show the other countries, the other peoples, how the situation is here, and it's still important. And I hope that your trip is it's interesting for you now, and I hope our work also will be interesting for you. So everybody who wants to visit Kyiv, don't worry about nothing. Just visit, and you can understand deeply what the situation is here now.
Angelica, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis, and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. If you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter and Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.